Do you agree with this statement? We're living in a time of moral chaos. Yes, no, what do you think? Yeah? Yeah, I wasn't kidding about engaging here. What's your evidence? Does it feel weird to be asked, what's your evidence to say we're living in a time of moral chaos? It's like, isn't it obvious? You said Twitter, social media, the war, Israel-Hamas war right now. I think that the sexual revolution, I think this is a statement that you're going to find almost universal agreement for. Christian, non-Christian, Republican, Democrat, pro-life, pro-choice. Pick your category, right, that people might fall in. You ask them this statement, is the world, are we living in a time of moral chaos? And I think everybody's going to say yes. Now, people might cite different examples of what this moral chaos is, but I think it's interesting that in a time of such hostility, where the world is seemingly becoming more polarized, more groups, we're increasingly dividing ourselves into different camps, lacking the ability to talk with people we don't agree with, that in such a time as this, you can find agreement on anything is interesting to me. And it's interesting that when it comes to morality, I think all people would say, yes, the world is not as it should be. The world is broken. Which raises some interesting questions, doesn't it? If the world is broken, what does that imply? Somebody, if you're wrong, I'll just make fun of you. So we'll get past that. If most people would agree that the world is broken, that it's chaotic right now regarding morality, what does brokenness imply? That there's a way it should be, that there's a standard. What then is that standard? Don't offer Sunday school answers. This idea right here is one reason why I'm optimistic, despite how dark things seem. No matter how much pain exists in the world today because of this moral chaos, the fact that people recognize that it is broken, what's the way it should be then? What is our hope? And part of today's purpose is for us to understand clearly how others think the world is broken and what its cause is, for us to be able to show the real cause of the brokenness and ultimately point them to Jesus Christ. But to just give a couple of examples of some of this moral chaos, and when I say this, I'm not using these examples to say, look at how wrong they are. I'm just using these examples here to show how that it's just a time of great confusion on moral issues. Are there any racists here today? You want to raise your hand? Racists? Wait, no, one racist raising their hand. Wow, JK, we're going to have a talk. Good luck. You think you'll meet anybody that's openly advocating for the subjugation of one race? You think you're going to find anybody out there marching with the banner that says this group of people are inferior because of some arbitrary characteristic like skin color? Surely there's some. But we live in a time in history where more people than not, at least in the Western world, would say racism is wrong. It's an inherent evil. Now, what's your definition of racism? That's an interesting question, right? And you would think that if so many people are, quote unquote, against racism, why is it such a hot button issue right now? It's a very divisive issue right now regarding this wokeness and woke worldview. And part of the reason is this. So Robin DiAngelo wrote a book several years ago called White Fragility. It's kind of in a corpus of books dealing with a modern approach to understanding racism and combating it. And one of the points that she makes in this book is that she came to see that the way that we are taught to define racism makes it virtually impossible for white people to understand it. The definition of racism that I think I grew up with would be kind of like a Martin Luther King definition of racism. That it's wrong to judge people on the basis of arbitrary characteristics, but rather we should judge them on the content of their character. And so racism, a kind of simple, if you will, Martin Luther King kind of idea and understanding of it, is it's just simply wrong to discriminate on the basis of an arbitrary characteristic like somebody's skin color. Does that seem like a fair definition of racism? Probably the definition of racism you grew up understanding, and the understanding of racism that you probably came to believe that is wrong. That is just wrong. It is inherently evil to devalue a group of human beings simply because of their skin color. That's not the new definition of racism. So as D'Angelo goes on to say, she says, however, if I understand racism as a system into which I was socialized, I can receive feedback on my problematic racial patterns as a helpful way to support my learning and growth. And her definition of racism, and not just hers, but shared by a great number of other people, would be something like this: that those who are in power, the majority, inevitably create systems, institutions that reflect their preferences. And they build a racist world, even unintentionally. And one of the points she wants to make, and she makes very often in this book, is she's like, I get it that when I call you a racist, you feel like now you got to fight. Because she's like, how dare you judge me? You don't know me. I'm not a racist. And she says, I'm not calling you immoral. I agree that you probably don't hate somebody just because of their skin color, but you have been born into a system of oppression and you aren't aware of it and you're perpetuating it. The American system is inherently racist because it was built by white men. And so it has to all be torn down in order for there to be fairness and equality. That idea, that's kind of central to the woke idea, doesn't exist just in matters of race. It also pertains to matters of sexuality, because it's the same idea. What is your notion when you think, you think of racism, you have an idea in your head. When you think of what is proper sexual behavior, what comes into your mind? What is your imagination and your vision for marriage? Is it something like God made one man, one woman, and gave them the opportunity to become one flesh, a comprehensive union, mind, body, and soul, that is inherently ordered towards procreation and family life, and it is permanent and exclusive regardless of any spouse's personal feeling. And this institution becomes the stabilizing force of civilizations because healthy families breed healthy civilizations. Is that part of your vision and imagination of marriage? Well, there are many that would say that's an oppressive vision that is simply the product of this country being built by white, straight men. And it is oppressive to those that wouldn't identify a certain way or have sexual preferences that aren't like that. Therefore, in the name of justice, these systems must be destroyed. We have to take down education because it's simply a system that was built that maintains a certain status quo. We have to really even consider the U.S. Constitution because of who it was created by. We have to revisit the notion of marriage, family, and even our notions of gender and sexuality because these ideas were created by an oppressor group, again, namely white, straight men. And this is fundamentally what is broken with the world. And if we all want to experience heaven, if you will, find salvation from the brokenness in this world, we need to awaken to this reality, destroy the systems of oppression so that people can pursue whatever path they so choose. And this has led to a lot of moral confusion. It's chaotic because we're dealing with issues where on one hand it seems like we think the same way, but we clearly don't. We're not even meaning the same thing when we say, yeah, I'm against racism, you say you're against racism. We don't even have the same definition of racism anymore. So it's a very confusing time. And so how did we get here? Where even is here? How would you describe the state of moral things today? I would describe it like we're living in a moral wasteland, some kind of dystopian reality. Have any of you read some of the classic dystopian novels of the last century, things like 1984 by George Orwell? How many of you say you read it, but you really didn't? You just did the Cliff Notes because you had to write a paper on it in school. And at a conference like this, you got to sound smart. Yeah, I read 1984. Brave New World by Huxley. Fahrenheit. Thank you, my daughter, who was just, you just read that, seeing if you really did read that. I was listening, trying to audiobooks. I can't do audiobooks. I know some of y'all love them. I'm trying to do audiobooks. I just can't do them. So I was trying to do an audiobook with 1984, and I was making a good way through it. And I had this experience. I was just, maybe 6 months ago doing it. And I'm like, Orwell is describing the world we're living in right now. Ministry of truth. So we're living in this profound time of chaos. And so it's more than the point of view of this talk isn't just to say, look at how bad that group of people are. Can you believe they think like that? Can you believe they act like that? Can you believe they're wanting to pursue a society like that? That's not even the fundamental part of this talk. It's just, how did we get into such a confusing situation where people are talking about morality again? It's not just let people do whatever they want. No, where people are arguing for what they think is good. But what does the word good even mean anymore? We're living in a profound time of moral confusion, and we've got to figure out the way forward, because I don't think that I'm being overly dramatic. I do not think the freedom that we've known in the West will survive the current state of moral confusion. Have you noticed that people are almost giving up arguing with one another? Have you found yourself to be arguing with somebody about an important issue? And by arguing, I don't mean a shouting match. I mean, you present your reasons, they present their reasons. Have you found yourself arguing over an important issue and just getting nowhere? I mean, that's always been the human experience in arguing, right? You feel like you're getting nowhere. But it's different. It's a little bit different now, isn't it? I mean, I'm not as old as some of you in this room, but I remember a time where it seemed like moral discourse in particular had the chance of being profitable. Now it doesn't feel like that. It feels like you're just talking past each other over whatever the analogy is. It's going nowhere. And so here's the danger, right? When we as a society lack a shared vision of truth, much less the tools to pursue truth together, civilly, built on reason and respect, all that's left for us to pursue is power. The power to silence those that do not think like us. The power to cast out those who have a different vision for what life should be. And that is the world that is taking shape, at least here in the United States. And the freedom that we've known in this country will not survive that. Now, many of you are followers of Jesus Christ. Is our ultimate aim to see that we have a free and flourishing civilization? Is that our ultimate aim? No. Our ultimate aim would be to help people find an abundant life in the person of Jesus Christ. But just because that is our ultimate aim, it does not mean that we should not also seek to be good citizens in the land in which the Lord has called us to live and to seek the good of our neighbor. And so for those two reasons, we, the church, must understand the times in which we're living so that we can be faithful ambassadors for truth, ultimately helping people to find the abundant life they were made for in Jesus Christ, but also to seek the good of the country in which we are living. Ultimately, I think freedom is at stake here in this time of great moral confusion. So what's the way forward? And how about a heavy topic to start off the morning, right? So what's the way forward? Well, I think the way forward involves understanding how we ended up in this situation to begin with. This talk will be a bit foundational in that sense. It's not going to answer every question about what we should do next, but it's kind of to give us a starting place. How did we get here? Which I think is essential if we're going to understand, okay, what do we do next? So I think understanding how we ended up in this moral wasteland, I think it provides us three things. This is my thesis for this morning, for those of you that are taking notes. And for those of you that are really diligently taking notes about as fast as a broke person as a Dave Ramsey conference, don't tell Scott I stole his joke there. At the end of the presentation, there'll be a slide that has a QR code where you can get my detailed 6-page notes of this talk. So feel free to, lean into your carpal tunnel, if you want, taking notes, or just relax knowing you can have the detailed notes by use of the QR code afterwards. But this is where we're going. I think we have to understand how we ended up in this morally confusing situation because it provides us with three really practical things. Clarity for our own moral confusion, guidance for moral discourse, some tools that you can use when you leave today that will help you have more productive conversations about important moral issues. And third, I think it will give us motivation for moral living. And we'll look at that. So to do this, we got to go back a bit. Going to be a bit of a historical journey here, but not too much dry history for those of you that are in school and like, oh my gosh, it's Saturday, history, forget about it. Please, can I go leave right now? Just a short trip back to the Enlightenment, where a lot of these ideas that are wreaking havoc today have their origin. The Enlightenment, also known as the Age of Reason, was a cultural and intellectual movement that emerged in Europe in the late 17th and 18th centuries. You may be familiar with names like Descartes, John Locke, Voltaire, Rousseau, Kant, Hume, Adam Smith, and so on. And we're not going to go any further into those historical figures and philosophers. We really kind of need to know the end result or some of the two big consequences of the Enlightenment. And I think the two biggest consequences, if you will, of the Enlightenment are the death of God and the rejection of Aristotelian or Christian telos. And I'll define that for you in a second. But first, when it comes to the death of God, what famous historical figure, philosopher, moral philosopher comes to your mind when it relates to the pronouncement of God's death? Who famously declared that God is dead? Yeah, it's Nietzsche. I got reprimanded 2 lectures ago from a young college student that says, it's not Nietzsche. And she had all the moral disdain for my use of Nietzsche. And evermore, I will not make the mistake again because she is correct. It is Nietzsche. Now, he's really not an Enlightenment philosopher. He's kind of post-Enlightenment, right after it. And so the important thing to understand with Nietzsche is his pronouncement of God's death, if you will, wasn't radical. It was merely an observation about what at least the academic elite, the upper class people had already come to believe in. Yeah, God doesn't exist. And Nietzsche has this declaration of God's death in a couple of places. One of the more interesting ones to me is in the book called The Gay Science, which of course, if you're a young person, you're like, that's a really funny title. Gay didn't always have a word relating to sexual orientation. It had a different meaning happy in a sense. But in the gay science, Nietzsche has a parable called the parable of the madman. And it's such a fun read. If you've never read the parable of the madman, you can Google it and you can read it, and it's pretty interesting. But that's one of the first places you see this declaration of the pronouncement of God's death. And Nietzsche says, "Whither is God?" he cried. "I will tell you. We have killed him. You and I, all of us, are his murderers." Now, Nietzsche was an atheist. He had a very strong dislike for Christians. Nietzsche also had a very strong dislike for the intellectually dishonest. And one of Nietzsche's pastimes, hobbies, if I can put it that way, was to ridicule and mock atheists for their lack of insight. And the parable of the madman, it's an interesting parable because it's not a celebration of the success of modern society rejecting the belief of God. It's not the celebration of it. The parable of the madman is intended to mock the atheists that have not realized what they've done. The death of God for Nietzsche was a cataclysmic event on par with the earth being unchained from the sun. And he mocks atheists that didn't recognize that were just going on like, woohoo, all right, on to the next thing. Nietzsche says, you have no idea what we've done. And he goes on in this parable to say, what were we doing when we unchained the earth from its sun? Whither is it moving now? Whither are we moving? Away from all suns? Are we not plunging continually? Backward, sideward, forward, in all directions? Is there still any up or down? Are we not straying as through an infinite nothing? What is Nietzsche describing? When you destroy the ordering principle for reality, it's like you just got flung off into the infinite darkness and you have no reference point at all. And Nietzsche understood, I'm going to say it wrong, I don't care. He understood the way that the belief, for Nietzsche anyways, in the existence of God, how it was the metaphysical foundation for Western civilization. It was the ordering principle. Because with the existence of God, you have things like inherent meaning to life. You have intrinsic value for human beings. You have a moral code that is transcendent, not subjective. And the entire Western world was built on that belief. It actually goes back to Plato, as we're going to see, but it's definitely in line with Christianity. And Nietzsche understands when you kill God, you kill Christianity, you kill all of that. It all goes away. And you got to build something back. And Nietzsche understood how challenging that was going to be. And he would regularly mock the intellectually dishonest atheists who are like, woohoo, God's dead, let's go. He goes on and elsewhere to describe, this was hard, this was like some serious cut down language for Nietzsche. He went on to describe the English fatheads who think that their moral intuitions are good enough. We don't need God. We have our own moral intuitions. We don't need God to ground or justify morality. We know within ourselves what is good. And Nietzsche just says, that's just because you're too dumb to realize how much you've been influenced by Christianity. It's like you ran God out of the church and then you set up shop in the church and we're still following the same rule book. You just gave certain different names for things. So anyways, but the death of God was a significant event in the Enlightenment where, from a societal standpoint, at least the academic elites, some of the ruling class, if you will, began to operate with the assumption God does not exist. Nietzsche saw this was going to be problematic, and we'll come back to that. But the other thing that was killed off or rejected during the time of the Enlightenment was this thing called telos. It's a Greek word, And the word telos means the intrinsic or ultimate purpose for which a thing exists. It's the why something exists, what it is for. And though that may sound pretty technical, it's a pretty straightforward and easy concept that I'm sure everybody could grasp here. What would you say the telos, the ultimate purpose, is of a hammer? You better get this because my 8-year-old got it yesterday. To drive nails. It has an ultimate end for why it exists. Now, you might be able to use hammers for other things, but it has a true purpose. And we could go through any number of things, right? And you would be able to pretty quickly identify the reason why that thing exists. Well, going all the way back to Plato, and even probably before that, the Western world operated on the assumption that telos existed for all things, including human beings. That mankind had a telos, an ultimate aim for our existence, something that we could strive for, live up to. And in the realization of that telos, there is joy. That was a Greek idea that may be sound a little Christian to you, and it's not contrary to a Christian understanding of the way life is. In Christianity, we would say that the ultimate end of mankind is to know God and enjoy him forever. And there are right and wrong ways to go about that true end, that true purpose. Well, the Western world had a certain stabilization to it, going all the way back to the Greeks. And then when Christianity started to influence, there was still this same idea that mankind had an ultimate aim, something that they were to live up to, which this becomes the building blocks for an ethical framework, an understanding of mankind as they are, a belief in what mankind could be if it reached its telos, and then ethics was the science or the blueprint in order to attain that telos and the joy therein. But that was rejected in the Enlightenment. No. Ultimate aims, true purposes, objective ends, those don't exist. And that is a cataclysmic event on par with the death of God. And I would say they go hand in hand, because if God does not exist, it would then also be true that things do not have true objective purpose. But let's conceive of this like this way. What is this right here? Why are you laughing? What is this? You feel like I'm setting you up? You feel like this is a trick question? No, what is this? Again, my 8-year-old got it. It's a stapler. It's a dinosaur stapler. But have you ever, said to somebody, hey, would you go, maybe you were homeschooled, or maybe this was in the classroom or whatnot, or maybe just at home, you would say, hey, go get me the stapler. And then you would say, no, go get me, no, not that one, get the good stapler. Have you ever said something like that? What makes a stapler good? Can it staple or not? So the use of the word good there is predicated upon understanding what? Its purpose. What would the word good mean if staplers had no telos, no ultimate purpose, no end for which that they exist? What would the word good mean there? It would mean whatever you want it to mean. Completely subjective. It literally, it's almost like this thought exercise here. It's like, wait a minute, you're asking me some really strange things. This doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense to think of a stapler as having no true end. How could a stapler as a created thing not have a true end, which then grounds our understanding in what a good stapler is versus what a bad stapler is? Obviously, it has a design, and if it functions according to its design, we say it's good. Well, just imagine as if we lived in a world that rejected the belief that staplers had any true design. It's just hard to even imagine that, right? That's what happened in the Enlightenment. Western civilization had always understood human beings have a true purpose. And so words like "that's a good man" actually mean something because they're closer to living up to that true end. So what does a good man even mean anymore? What is a good woman? If you reject the notion that there's a true end for mankind, what happens to the word good? And this is one of the biggest consequences of the Enlightenment. It's just this. What happens to ethics when God dies and telos is rejected? I'll give you a second to sit on that and think for a second, because I know it's early and I can go fast. I'm from New Jersey. What happens when there is this broad rejection of God and a rejection of this idea that human beings actually have a true purpose? What happens to ethics when those two things go away? What do you think? Entirely subjective, meaning each individual could determine for themselves what their true end is. Not based on anything objective, entirely subjective. Do you think that leads to order or chaos? Chaos. It's a bit of I don't know if it's an oversimplification, but it's a very simple way to describe what happened during the Enlightenment. If you're interested in a more in-depth look at this, there's a couple of good books out there written by the same guy right now, Carl Trueman. He wrote a book called The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, which is a very detailed look at the history of these ideas that emerged in the Enlightenment and how they made their way into everyday life today. If you don't want to read Rise and Triumph of the New Self, which is that long, you can read A Strange New World, which is that long, written by Truman, and it was his way of condensing it because he had some good friends that said, hey, this is one of the most important books of the last 20 years. Nobody's going to read that book because it's that big. You got to make a shorter one. And so he wrote that. And if you are interested locally, my friend Kevin put together a very helpful small group discussion guide that if you wanted to read that book with others and then meet up in a month to talk about the main ideas in that book and what it means for us, talk to me and I can introduce you to Kevin afterwards. It'd be a very, very helpful resource for you. So this big picture, what happens to ethics when God dies and telos is rejected? There's no ordering principle anymore for humanity to pursue a moral life. And each person is left to pursue for themselves whatever end they see fit. But we didn't go straight to subjectivism, historically speaking. In the death of God, there was the emergence of what you might call secular rational ethics. So rational would be simply something that is built on the pursuit of reason, not the individual. So in contrast to like subjectivism, a rational approach to ethics wouldn't be going as far as saying, no. We can't just let everybody do whatever they want. Let's find some objective, ordering principle that can guide us morally speaking. And if you look post-Enlightenment on, you saw the emergence of secular rational ethics. You've had people like Jeremy Bentham, John Stuart Mills, even Peter Singer developing ethical theories in the broad category of utilitarianism. Utilitarianism was an ethical framework not built on subjective emotions of individuals, but it was an attempt to build an ethical system on something objective. And from Bentham, it was called the principle of utility. And he said, what is fundamentally true is that people prefer pleasure to pain, so we should order our societies on that which he would call an objective belief. We should order our behavior and build our civilizations in order to maximize pleasure for the most amount of people and minimize suffering for the most amount of people possible. And that becomes an objective principle to build a rational system of ethics. It doesn't work, though. It doesn't work. And this won't be a lecture on the inherent problems of a utilitarian ethical framework, but if you want to see the problems, just go watch Endgame from the MCU. Thanos was a utilitarian. He wanted to create a universe to maximize the happiness for as many people as he could, and the path to it was he had to kill off half the population to begin with, but that would result in the future happiness of a countless number of people. That's an interesting thought experiment to do, especially with young adults that are into the Marvel movies, is to ask them, why is Thanos the bad guy? Why is he not the tragic hero? If in the Marvel Cinematic Universe there is no creator God, why would Thanos be the villain? He's clearly driven by a moral guiding principle. He's willing to sacrifice that which is most dear to him, even his own life, in order to do what is necessary to bring about a flourishing to all living beings in a way they've never experienced before, to bring them their ultimate salvation. Why is he the villain if there is no created God? So anyways, I'm getting long-winded on this right here. But in the death of God, the West was guided by this guiding ethical principle that was rooted in something transcendent. There were a number of people that said, okay, we don't believe in God, but we still have to figure out a way forward, morally speaking. What's going to be that guiding principle? And there were various attempts to build ethical systems that don't rely on the existence of God. And I would say wokeism is another one of those examples. It's an appeal to build an ethical framework that will bring about human flourishing without appealing to anything transcendent. It's just a look at the brokenness of this world. What is the cause of this brokenness? Christianity would say sin, rebellion from God. The woke worldview would say one group in power used their power to oppress other people, even those, some may have done it intentionally, but some didn't know they were doing it, but they still did it nonetheless. And salvation will come from here. So wokeism is really in line with a lot of these different ethical systems that were put forward throughout the ages. But ethical systems that don't appeal to something transcendent, something beyond just the material world, they are destined to fail. And I don't simply say that as a Christian. I would just say that as one that has considered the consequences of ethical systems that don't rely upon God. Nietzsche observed that himself. Alistair MacIntyre wrote one of the more classic books on moral philosophy in the last 30 years. And MacIntyre, who is not a believer unless I've missed something, he said Nietzsche perceived the failure of this rational attempt to justify morality. Nietzsche perceived this better than anybody else. And this is one of these things that I can appreciate about Nietzsche. Though I go back and forth between his ideas make me sick, I can appreciate his intellectual honesty. Because Nietzsche said, if God does not exist, there is no purpose to life. There is no objective meaning to anything. So all these attempts to build a rational, ethical framework, it's not you're just appealing inevitably to something subjective, something that a group of people just decided that, yes, we prefer this idea more than that idea. And Nietzsche came out pretty strong and said, therefore, all ethical systems are just power plays. So this idea of power play, by the way, carrying forward to wokeism, some of this is in Nietzschean philosophy. All systems of morality are just power plays. It's one group of people trying to control another group of people. And it's time for us to cast aside all ethical systems. And it's time for the rise of the Superman. The Übermensch is what Nietzsche called it. an individual so strong, they wouldn't have to look at any external ordering principle. They could simply look within and create, as Nietzsche would often say, tables of value for themselves and live according to their own desires and their own will, and would be able to create a world in their image. And from the 1900s on, you begin to see the rise of subjectivism. And the two big ideas there are the decisive authority of inner feelings and the moral obligation of self-expression or expressive individualism. So you get where this is coming from, and you can even appreciate Nietzsche's insight here. Yes, if God does not exist, there is no reason why things exist. It's just here because of an accident. Therefore, life does not have any inherent meaning. There is no ultimate purpose to anything else. So what's left? All that's left are the inner subjective feelings of each individual. That is the only guiding principle that matters. So just be true to yourself. And along with that comes the idea of people must be free to express themselves however they see fit, based on the inner psychological feelings or understanding that they have. So if you, though biologically are a male, but inwardly feel as if you're a woman, nobody should prevent you from living out that internal reality. And to tell somebody you cannot be true to yourself in this worldview is wrong. Because if there is no objective meaning or standard to life, who are you to say what somebody should or shouldn't do? Does that sound like the world we live in? It's actually not the world we live in. It's worse than that. Going back to Alasdair MacIntyre, he wrote this really interesting book. It's hard to read. It's best to read this book with somebody else. It's a book you kind of need to read twice, or read it with somebody smarter than you. I wish I would have had someone smarter than me to read it with when I was reading it. But he advances some really important ideas in this book. And one of them is he begins the book with a thought experiment. He said, imagine a world where the natural sciences were to suffer the effects of a catastrophe, like some cataclysmic world event that resulted in science being banned, scientists being persecuted, laboratories being burnt down, and books being destroyed. Then imagine years later there becomes a revived interest in science. And people start to find fragments of textbooks. They find a burned down lab with some still useful tools in it, but they don't really even know the names. But then they find the names and they start using the names. They start using scientific language, but it's devoid of the context from which these scientific theories emerged. And people even start now arguing about scientific theories, using scientific language, but they have none of the context from where these ideas even came from. How productive do you think science would be in that world? It'd be futile. It'd be impossible. MacIntyre says, what's the point of this thought experiment about this world in which science was forgotten and tried to put back together in a fragmented way? He said, it's because that's the world we're actually living in, but morally speaking. The West today is a place of fragmented moral ideas. You have the remnants of a worldview that believes in something transcendent. God, a holy God, in whom his holy nature is the ordering principle for goodness and badness, right and wrong. You have the remnants of that worldview and the ethical implications that come from the existence of something transcendent. You have the remnants of these secular ethics like utilitarianism, Rawlsianism, Kantian deontology. Now you have things like wokeness. But you just have bits and pieces of all this. And of course, in all of this, you have this subjectivism, this Nietzschean subjectivism, which if you want to know how good of a moral philosopher Nietzsche was, like what was his plan for society? If he believed this was true, what political theory did he offer to help us kind of order ourselves? You know what Nietzsche's theory was? Well, if you figure it out, you tell me, because I don't think he had one. And people don't know, scholars really don't think Nietzsche had one. In fact, what he just kind of thought was the Western world was going to blow up. He predicted a bloody 20th century, which of course did happen. And Nietzsche's implicit hope was after that bloody massacre of a century where mankind gives up any ordering principle, that in the ashes thereafter, that would be where the Superman arises. Now, how these Supermen were to get along with one another, he doesn't offer any help. But so that's the world we live in. It's just sheer chaos. You have these broken fragments of morality that people just have picked up and absorbed. So let's go back to that thesis. Understanding, so how does this help us at all? Understanding that we live in a broken, messy, morally fragmented Western world. How does that help us with anything? Well, here I think it brings clarity, guidance, and motivation. And here's how. To what degree have you been affected by all these competing ethical frameworks that you're unaware of? How would you even know, right? That's part of McIntyre's thesis too, by the way. And Truman's thesis is it's really hard to gain the perspective to know. Yeah, it's really hard to know. But here's one question I think to help us know. And it's a simple question. Do you believe there is design? Do you believe there is telos? A true purpose for life? Do you really believe that? And if you do, are you living out that belief with intellectual consistency? Because if there is design and a true ultimate aim for humanity, men and women, that would also cover our sexuality, would it not? So I get that the LGBTQ agenda and all the issues is complicated, emotionally challenging. There's probably not a single person in this room that doesn't know somebody who is gay or trans. And they're probably somebody you love. And you see their personal grief and their struggle for a meaningful life and joy. But here's the question. Is there a true end for men and women or not? If there is, joy is found in discovering that and conforming your life to it, not conforming your life to your inner subjective emotions and feelings and experiences. So do you see how this idea helps to bring a little bit of clarity on at least one really important moral issue of our time, those pertaining to sexuality and gender? If it is true that there is such a thing as telos, that God exists, made mankind in his image, and there is an overarching purpose to our lives, a grand story that we are a part of, then there is something for us to live up to, something outside of ourselves. And in conformity to that, there is abundant life. If not, then the only hope we have is to pursue whatever inner feelings we have, which is a very futile, I think, endeavor. Have you ever had feelings that change? And I don't mean that to be trite regarding some of these issues that are very, very personal to us. But if the only guide we have are our inner subjective feelings, that's a very bleak world to live in. And I don't know what much hope there is for a meaningful or happy life. But because there is a God who created all things, designed all things, and because that includes our lives that have true purpose, we can understand that purpose and then pursue living out that purpose, and in that there is joy. I think this is one of the central messages of Jesus. You think of illustrations like the vine and the branches. This is what Jesus is teaching. In me and in my ways are life. So for your own more personal moral confusion, a simple idea, and there's a lot more to this discussion, right? But a very simple idea, something for you to take away and think about. When you're confused about the moral issues of our time, just ask yourself this question, okay, do I believe there's actual design and purpose? If so, what does that mean for this particular situation? And reflect on that and see. Here's how I think this gives us guidance for moral discourse. I want to give you some questions. Going back even 50 years ago, there was a pretty prominent moral philosopher, Anscombe, that says we need to give up moral discourse until we can at least agree what words mean. So the word good right now, what does the word good even mean? So think about the last argument you were in about a moral issue. Let's just say it was like abortion. And someone's arguing that it is good for women to have the right to choose, that they should have the right to choose what to do with their reproductive abilities, or however it's going to be put. Not that you should just give up entirely arguing about the issue of abortion. What I'm saying is you must have more fundamental conversations and questions. The most basic and fundamental is, hey, what do you mean by good? When you say it is good and it would be wrong for us to do this, what do you mean by that? What makes something good? It's a really interesting question. And it's a concept we just don't think about. We just use the word good. Oh, that's good, that's bad. Well, why? What makes something good? What makes something bad? Is something good because it's close to, in line with its true purpose? Is it good simply because you like it? What makes this thing good? And is that partly why maybe we're just talking past each other? These things broadly, and of course these just fall into the category of ethics, but I want to think about this and ask yourself this question. Is ethics taught anymore? It's not. It's crazy. If you're a young adult here, middle school or high school student, go ask your parents afterwards how they make moral decisions. See what they have to say. Adults, how would we answer that question to the next generation? When they say, hey, how do you go about making all these complicated decisions in life? How do you know what's good and what's not? The Bible, you can't just say the Bible says, because the Bible doesn't say about a lot of different things. You have to use wisdom to apply biblical principles to understand moral decision making today. So don't just say, you can't just give me the Bible says that I believe it, because the Bible doesn't say a lot about a lot, because there's an unending number of moral situations that the Bible could never exhaustively answer. So how do you use the Bible to make moral decisions? We all have some way that we go about making decisions. Do you know what that is yourself? Could you pass that on to somebody else? Probably not. Nobody thinks about these things anymore. Nobody teaches them. It's like we've all just bought into a Nietzschean subjectivism and we just let everybody just make a decision based on what they think. Oh, I prayed about it. I feel like I have peace about this decision. So I think this is just a really powerful question, one for personal reflection, but also in conversation with somebody who doesn't think like you. What do you mean by good? What makes something good? Why should I be good? Who am I accountable to? Or if I were to write that properly, to whom am I accountable? This is an especially interesting and powerful question when you're dealing with somebody that doesn't believe in God or anything transcendent. This notion of moral accountability. The answer to why should I be moral, someone might just say, well, because it's better off for you and it'll make you happier or whatever. So my moral accountability is only to myself? Well, no. You can't just do whatever you want. You can do whatever you want as long as it doesn't hurt somebody else. Well, why? Well, because it's not good for you. Okay, so it's back to self-interest. And it's better when we all just get along. Okay, well, what if I'm clever enough, powerful enough to take advantage of all you suckers? Why shouldn't I do that? If, as a civilization and a society, we've agreed that the source of moral accountability is the individual, that's the justification for every villain that's ever existed. And I think this is a deeply problematic position for the atheistic kind of worldview. Last thing, and I'm running over my time here. Here's how I think this gives motivation for moral living. This is, I think, relevant for us all, but especially for our youth. In John chapter 15, when Jesus is doing this teaching on the vine and the branches, Jesus says things pretty strongly, things like, you must obey what I command. If you're going to be my friends, you have to obey what I say. But Jesus is very clear to say, these things I've spoken to you, that my joy may be in you, and that your joy may be full. If it is true that because God exists, there is an ultimate aim for my life, is it not reasonable to believe that if I follow the Maker's plan for that, it will go well for me? And I don't mean rich and prosperous, I mean deeply satisfying. Doesn't that stand to reason? That if the creator of all things laid out for us how we are to live, that in following his ways, we would find the deepest desires of our heart to be met and satisfied. So those of us that struggle with this conception of Christianity, it's just rule-based, gotta fall in line, gotta do these things to appease some angry God, and I gotta do these rules so I don't go to hell. That's a childish, immature view of Christianity. The teachings of Jesus are meant to give you life, lead you to the kind of life that is found by abiding in him, the source of all that there is. And so why pursue a moral life? Because in it you will find Jesus Christ, who is the deepest desire of your heart's longings. And last part here. This motivation. In a morally chaotic world where there are so many competing ideas that have made their way down, it's confusing. And a lecture like this may even lead to more confusion. Hopefully there's been some ideas that you can hang on to that maybe give you a little bit of clarity. But it's not simply through arguments that we come to understand what is really real. It's through things like our imagination. And what do you think the quality of Christian lives demonstrate to a non-believing world when it comes to matters of morality? You can think about the argument over things like gay marriage. Well, what does a Christian's marriage show this world? Does the quality of our life give other people a vision and an imagination and a hope for what could be if we followed Jesus. So in a morally confusing time, one of the ways, the way to love our neighbor as ourselves is to understand the ideas of our time so we can be better in conversation, answering their questions, leading them to the truth. But we also must demonstrate the goodness of these beliefs in the way that we live. And so this is a simple call for those of you that are followers of Jesus Christ. It's a call to repentance. It's a call to persevere and to continue following the teachings of Jesus Christ. And may our lives reflect the goodness that comes from abiding in him. And if we do these things, may we pray and hope and trust that God will use our words and our lives to bring some clarity in a chaotic time so that people find life in Jesus Christ. And in so doing, may the Lord also bring a time of peace to this country and this land that we live in. Amen? Amen. Thank you.